Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is come over to the top of the engine and remove your plastic cover. To remove the plastic cover, you're going to find two 10mm headed nuts. One over here and one on the driver's side. Remove the pair. Now when you unscrew this, it's common for the stud that goes down into the valve cover to come out as well. That's okay. We'll go ahead and set this aside and fully remove the other nut as well. Inspect your hardware as you continue. Now let's carefully remove that plastic cover. We'll give it a quick inspection and set it aside. Now that we have that out of the way, we have a nice clear view of the entire valve cover. Before we continue removing anything else, it's important to make sure that you clean the area. The areas that you want to pay attention to is along the top of the valve cover. You have all your ignition coils here. You want to make sure there's no dirt or debris. Also, along the very edge of the valve cover, you want to pay attention there. Make sure you don't see any dirt or debris or any type of moisture. Now let's continue inspecting along where the engine and valve cover connect. I want to make sure I wipe this down. The reason why we're cleaning this down is because we want to make sure nothing falls inside the engine while we're replacing the valve cover gasket. We'll make our way all the way around. Now that we've finished cleaning the entire area, the next thing we're going to do is move along to each of our ignition coils across the top. Now it's important whenever you're removing these that when you go to reinstall them, you put them back into the exact same port as where you removed them. So with that said, you can either place them in a position where you'd be able to locate that, or even just mark them with something such as a crayon or even nail polish. Now let's continue on to disconnecting each of the wires from the area. Go ahead and squeeze on the tab where my thumb is and carefully remove each of them. Every time you remove an electrical connector, just take a peek. If you see any funny colors, it's probably corrosion and that would need to be dealt with. Let's make our way right down the line. You might notice as you try to squeeze, it just doesn't want to release. If that's the case, continue on with a small pocket screwdriver and just get underneath the lip. Now let's take that wiring and carefully put it off to the side. Now we can continue removing each of our ignition coils. The process will be the same for all. You're going to do that by removing the 10mm mounting bolt. Inspect your hardware. Remove each coil. When you're doing this, pay attention. Make sure you didn't lose the seal for one of your ignition coils. If it seems like it slid off, it's very easy to slide right back on the coil. Let's move right over to this area, continuing with our 10mm. Move that bracket aside. We'll slide the wiring as far away as we can. Let's make our way over to the other side of the valve cover, continuing with our 10mm. Carefully grab onto that wiring harness and try to move it out of the way as much as possible. Let's use some compressed air and clean the area one more time. Now we're going to start disconnecting some hoses. You'll find that you have one along the back side of the valve cover. Carefully grab onto that clamp, give it a little squeeze, and then gently slide the hose off. Once you have the hose off of there, give it a quick inspection. Make sure it doesn't look like it's dry rotted, cracked, or damaged in any way. Assuming it looks good, set it aside, and then move over to the other side of the valve cover. The process for this will be the same exact thing. Squeeze the clamp, slide the hose. Now we're at the point that we can start unbolting the valve cover from the engine. You're going to find a whole bunch of mounting bolts and some nuts. We're going to make our way all the way across, and then make our way to the center. You'll notice the bolts that are in the center are a lot longer and they have washers. Now the next thing we have to do is carefully try prying the valve cover up and off of the engine. Whatever you use to do this, be extremely careful not to mar up the metal of the engine or even the valve cover. There we are. Now that it's broken free, I should be able to lift this straight up and off, being extremely careful not to drop anything into the engine. Let's set this valve cover aside for cleaning. Alright, so now at this point, the whole top of the engine's open. It's extremely important. Once again, make sure nothing falls into the top of your engine. Now with that said, we can continue on to carefully removing our valve cover gasket. As we remove this, there could potentially still be some sort of dirt or debris located on it that could fall in. So just pay close attention. You'll notice as we make our way towards the driver's side, the center is going to start coming out as well. Okay, so now it's cleanup time. We're going to start with the valve cover itself. Pay attention all the way along the valve cover where that gasket should be. You want to make sure that the groove all the way around is clean and free of any debris or miscellaneous oils. Also, keep in mind, you want to make sure these areas are cleaned out as well because that's also where the gasket's going to be. Now I'm going to take this to the parts washer and clean it down completely. Something to note is when you're cleaning this down, there's an area in the top of the valve cover here that has a port that leads all the way through. You want to be extremely careful when you're cleaning it so that you remove any solvent that might be in it by the time you're done. Now that we have this cleaned down, let's just use some compressed air to make sure there's no solvent in the area. Make sure you clean up your oil cap. Now that we have all that completely cleaned down, let's move along to the engine itself. Now we're going to clean the entire top of the engine where the gasket's going to go. Generally, cleaning this down overall is going to be very easy, but there is a couple areas that you want to pay attention to. You'll find that you have one area across the front of the engine here, and then on the back side of the engine, in the same exact area, you're going to find a second area. Now, each of those areas is going to have a little bit of gasket maker on there. That's super important to mention because you will have to put some gasket maker in that place when it comes time to reinstall the new gasket. We'll just carefully scrape this off away from the inside of the engine. Now, if you were to look at this area once you have it cleaned, you can tell exactly why there was a little bit of gasket maker. There's a small hairline crack that makes its way across this area and on the back side. That's because these are two separate pieces. You have your timing chain right here. Now, with that said, we have this side cleaned. I'm going to clean the other side, and then I'm going to wipe down the entire area of the engine where the new gasket's going to sit. If you find any areas that the rag does not want to remove the debris from, just carefully remove it with a straight edge razor. Once you have the outer portion cleaned up, continue on to the inner portion. You want to make sure you get all the way around each of your spark plug tubes, along this area, and of course, all the way on the other side of the engine. At this point, we can continue on to wiping this down. Now that I've cleaned the inside area, I'm going to move back along to this area. I'm going to make sure that I wipe this down completely. The two areas that I talked to you about before that you need to pay special attention to, you need to make sure there is no oily residue in those two areas. It's extremely important. Once you feel as though you have it cleaned down well enough, give it a close inspection. You need to be absolutely sure there's no gasket residue and that there's definitely no oily residue in those two areas. Now let's move back to the valve cover itself. It's going to be time to start installing our brand new valve cover gasket. Now for the gasket, what you're going to find is that it has a particular shape. Looking at the valve cover, you can tell it's not a perfect oval. So when you look at the gasket, you want to make sure that you have the same ridges that line up perfectly. Now as I start laying this out, I'm only going to gently start pressing it in so I can make sure it lines up along the way. Once it seems as though it's fine, I'll continue pressing it in the rest of the way. That looks pretty good along the edges. I'll pause on the edges and make my way to the center. Okay, at this point, this looks great. Let's continue by pressing it down completely into all of the ports. As you're doing it, make sure that it does not fall back out. Now I can continue on along the edges. Once you have your valve cover gasket in place in the valve cover, make your way back to the engine. This part's going to be extremely important as well. Each of those cracks that I talked to you about, one along the front and the same along the rear, you need to make sure that you use some high temperature, oil resistant, RTV or gasket maker. Essentially, we just want to put a small bead across this area to help make sure it seals properly. There we are. I'll do the exact same thing on the back side there. That's going to help make sure it seals up perfectly and we don't have to worry about an oil leak. Obviously, you don't want another oil leak. Now we can start putting the valve cover on here. While you're doing it, pay attention to the valve cover gasket, making sure that it does not fall out of place. If it does, once again, another oil leak. Carefully slide that down on there. Now before we start on any of our mounting hardware, just go ahead and take a peek all the way around the valve cover as much as you can see. If you have to, go ahead and use a mirror across the back. What we're trying to see is making sure that there's no gasket protruding out. Now we can start in all of our mounting hardware. We're not going to tighten any of our mounting bolts or nuts until we have each of them started. Once we start each of them, we'll snug these in a specific order. Now we can start bottoming each of these out, starting with the two center bolts. Now we can move to the outer bolts. We're going to start with the very center bolt in the rear. Make our way towards the passenger side. Once you have all of them bottomed out, continue on with your torque wrench. We're going to torque each of the center bolts to 10 foot-pounds. With those two torqued, let's move along to the outer bolts. Those have a separate torque. The torque for the outer bolts is 8 foot-pounds. We'll start from the center and do the exact same sequence as before. Now we can start reattaching our wiring brackets. Once both of them are started in, continue on by snugging them. Now we can move along to reconnecting our hoses. Squeeze the clamp, slide it right on there. Give it a tug to make sure it's completely secure. You do not want either of these hoses falling off while you're driving down the road. It's a good idea to try to place your clamps back in their original position. Now we can start inserting our ignition coils. Apply a thin amount of dielectric grease along the area that's going to go directly onto the spark plug. Now we'll take each of the ignition coils and carefully slide it down into place, making sure that we put them in their original positions. While you slide it down, make sure you're lining up your mounting bolt hole. Start in each of those mounting bolts as you go. Now we'll bottom each of those out and torque each of them to 80 inch-pounds. Typically, I clean off the markings on the top of the ignition coils. It doesn't need to be there. Now let's put our wiring in place. We want to make sure that we bring this entire wiring harness all the way across the valve cover. As I'm bringing it across, it only makes sense to make sure I'm plugging it in along the way. We'll press each of these in and listen for a click. You hear a click? Give it a little tug, make sure it's secure. Do the same down the line. Press the wiring down into place so it's safe. Now, before we continue on by putting on the oil cover and the engine cover, take a quick peek. Make sure that you definitely torqued every single bolt on the valve cover and the bolts for your ignition coils. After that, the next thing that I would want to mention to you is it's a good idea to go ahead and do an oil change. When you're doing your oil change, you can have a look at the top of your oil cap. That'll tell you exactly which type of oil to use. With all that said, let's finish this up. We'll put on the oil cap till it's bottomed out. Now it's time for the engine cover. Go ahead and line it up with the studs along the top of your valve cover. Now you can start on your mounting hardware. Once you have each of them started, go ahead and snug them up. Okay, friend, we got the valve cover on there. At this point, the next thing you want to do is go ahead and clean down the rest of the engine. After that, go ahead and start up the vehicle. Let it run for a little while. Make sure you don't have a check engine light, and then also make sure that you don't see an oil leak all the way around the valve cover there. Assuming it looks good, take it for a road test. Thanks for watching.